Frank, you gotta understand something. When people start disappearing, even friends get nervous. The voice on the 30-year-old tape was unmistakably Dean Martin's, but the fear in his usually smooth delivery was something his family had never heard before. Dean Martin, the man who'd made cool an art form, the guy who could make audiences laugh while sipping martinis and smoking cigarettes, sounded terrified. And he was talking about Frank Sinatra, not just his best friend and business partner, but the man he'd trusted with his life for over 2 decades. "What do you mean, disappearing?" Frank's voice crackled through the hidden speakers, slurred with whiskey and something darker. "Nobody's disappearing, Pally. People are just relocating." The laughter that followed sent chills down Richie Martin's spine as he listened to his father's secret recordings for the first time. It was December 1995, 3 days after Dean's death, and his son was cleaning out the basement bar of the Beverly Hills mansion when he discovered something that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's life. Hidden behind bottles of vintage Jack Daniels and Chivas Regal was a sophisticated recording system that looked like it belonged in a government surveillance operation, not a Hollywood entertainer's home bar. The equipment was military grade, the kind of stuff the CIA used, not something you could buy at the local electronics store. Someone had installed microphones throughout Dean's house, and the date stamps on the tape cases revealed a shocking truth. Dean Martin had been secretly recording his conversations with Frank Sinatra for over 30 years. But this wasn't just any recording system. Dean had documented everything, every casual reference to violence, every veiled threat wrapped in friendship's language, every moment when Frank's mask slipped and revealed the dangerous man underneath the blue eyes and million-dollar smile. The collection contained over 400 hours of audio spanning from 1962 to 1995, creating an unprecedented audio diary of what it was really like to be Frank Sinatra's closest friend. Ricky's hands were shaking as he read the handwritten note tucked inside the first tape case, dated December 16, 1962. "Started recording today. Frank came over drunk and angry about the Kennedy thing. He's talking about people like they're chess pieces, not human beings. He mentioned names, politicians, reporters, even some of our mutual friends, and what might happen to them if they don't cooperate. I love Frank like a brother, but I'm starting to think my brother might be a killer. If something happens to me, these tapes will explain why." The first tape Ricci played was from that same night in December 1962, right after Frank's humiliating rejection by the Kennedy administration. JFK had chosen to stay at Bing Crosby's house instead of Frank's Palm Springs compound, and Frank had arrived at Dean's place around midnight, drunker and more dangerous than Dean had ever seen him. "They think they can just cut me loose after everything I did for Jack." Frank's voice was thick with alcohol and rage. "I delivered Chicago for them, Dean. You know what that means. You know what I had to promise Sam Giancana to deliver Chicago." Dean's response was carefully measured. "Frank, maybe we should talk about this when you're sober, Pally." "I am sober." Frank had exploded. "I'm sober enough to know that Bobby Kennedy thinks he can destroy me. Well, I got news for little Bobby. I know where all the bodies are buried, and I mean that literally." The recording captured Frank pacing around Dean's living room. Then came the moment that changed everything between them. "You know what Sam told me last week, Dean? He said loyalty is a two-way street, but if your friends forget their obligations." Frank's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear as a gunshot. "What kind of obligations?" Dean had asked, though he probably didn't want to know the answer. "The kind that keep people breathing, Pally. The kind that make sure careers don't just disappear overnight." That conversation marked the moment Dean realized his best friend was no longer just an entertainer with questionable associates. He was a man who spoke casually about murder as a business solution. Frank detailed conversations with Sam Giancana about cleaning up loose ends and sending messages to people who'd crossed them. What made the recording truly terrifying was how normal Frank sounded while discussing these horrors. He talked about having people beaten or worse with the same casual tone he used to discuss song arrangements. Violence wasn't an aberration for Frank Sinatra. It was just another business tool. Then Martin was building an insurance policy against his own best friend. The early recording showed Frank gradually testing Dean's boundaries, making increasingly explicit references to violence, gauging his reaction to stories about people who disappeared. It was like watching a predator groom his prey, except the prey was his closest friend. March 15, 1963. Frank's voice on another tape. Remember that newspaper guy in Chicago who was writing stories about our business connections? Well, he won't be asking any more questions. Sam took care of it permanent like. Guy had a real bad accident on Lake Shore Drive. The tape captured Dean's sharp intake of breath. Jesus, Frank, you can't just say things like that. Why not?
It's just you and me here.
Pally, we're family, right? Family shares everything. But Dean was already wondering if being Frank Sinatra's family was more dangerous than being his enemy. The recording showed Dean excusing himself to the bathroom where the hidden microphones picked up the sounds of him being violently sick. Another tape captured Frank discussing a Las Vegas casino owner who was refusing to book Rat Pack shows. Tony Accardo thinks this guy needs an attitude adjustment, Frank had said. Maybe a little fire in his casino would help him see reason. Frank, stop talking, Dean had interrupted. I don't want to hear this stuff. You don't want to hear it, or you don't want to know it, Frank had challenged. Because there's a difference, Dean. People who don't want to know things sometimes find out the hard way that ignorance isn't protection. The threat was unmistakable. Frank was telling Dean that refusing to hear his confessions wouldn't keep Dean safe if authorities ever came asking questions. The tapes revealed that Dean's famous drinking wasn't just part of his stage persona. It was how he coped with the constant stress of maintaining a friendship that felt like a hostage situation. Several recordings captured Dean talking to himself after Frank left. He's my best friend, Dean had muttered on one tape. 20 years we've been like brothers, but I'm starting to think my best friend might be a stone-cold killer. December 15th, 1962. Read the date stamp on the most damaging recording. It was the night after Frank's falling out with the Kennedy administration when JFK had chosen to stay at Bing Crosby's house instead of Frank's compound. Frank had arrived at Dean's house drunk, angry, and more dangerous than Dean had ever seen him. They think they can just cut me loose after everything I did for Jack? Frank's voice crackled through the speakers, slurred with alcohol and rage. Bobby Kennedy thinks he's untouchable because he's the Attorney General. Well, I got news for him, Dean. I know where all the bodies are buried. Dean's response on the tape was carefully neutral. Maybe you should cool it, Pally. Walls have ears these days. Let him listen, Frank had snarled. I helped get Jack elected. I delivered Chicago. I delivered the West Coast. I delivered everything they needed. And now they want to pretend they don't know me because Sam Giancana makes them nervous. That conversation marked the beginning of Dean's secret documentation project. His family found a handwritten note tucked inside the first tape case. Started recording today. Frank is talking about things that could get us all killed. If something happens to me, these tapes will explain why. The recordings revealed that Dean Martin, the laid-back entertainer who seemed to float through life on charm and cocktails, had been living in constant fear of his best friend for over 30 years. The man who'd helped make Frank Sinatra the king of Las Vegas had become convinced that Frank was capable of having him murdered to protect his secrets. The tapes documented Frank's gradual transformation from entertainment partner to something much more dangerous. In the early recordings from the 1960s, their conversations were typical show business talk, bookings, money, women, music. But as federal investigations into organized crime intensified, Frank's casual references to violence became more frequent and more specific. March 8, 1963. Frank's voice on another tape. That newspaper guy in Chicago won't be writing any more stories about our business. Sam took care of it permanent like. Teason's response showed his growing unease. Jesus, Frank, you can't just say things like that. Why not? It's just you and me here, Pally. We're family, right? But Dean was already wondering if being Frank Sinatra's family was more dangerous than being his enemy. The recordings chronicled the Rat Pack's golden years through Dean's increasingly paranoid perspective. What the public saw as the height of cool Frank, Dean, and Sammy owning Las Vegas, living the high life, performing for presidents, Dean experienced as a nightmare of escalating threats and implicit violence. A particularly chilling recording from 1964 captured Frank discussing a problem with a casino owner who was resisting pressure to book Rat Pack shows. "Tony Accardo says the guy needs an attitude adjustment," Frank had said, referring to the Chicago mob boss. "Maybe a little accident to help him see reason." "Frank, stop." Dean had interrupted. "I don't want to hear this stuff." "You don't want to hear it or you don't want to know it," Frank had challenged. "Because there's a difference, Dean. A big difference." The tapes revealed that Dean's famous drinking wasn't just part of his stage persona. It was how he coped with the stress of maintaining a friendship that felt more like a hostage situation. His consumption increased dramatically after conversations with Frank, and several recordings captured Dean talking to himself after Frank left, working through his anxiety. "He's my best friend," Dean muttered on one tape after a particularly disturbing visit. "But I'm starting to think my best friend might be a killer." The most devastating recording came from 1966, when Frank arrived at Dean's house with blood on his shirt and dirt under his fingernails. Dean's hidden microphones caught everything. "I need to clean up, Pally. Got a little messy tonight." "Frank, what happened?" "Nothing that concerns you, just some business that needed handling." The recording captured the sound of running water, Frank washing his hands, then changing his shirt in Dean's guest room. When Frank left, Dean could be heard vomiting in his own bathroom. The tapes showed that Dean had tried multiple times to distance himself from Frank, but each attempt was met with veiled threats wrapped in friendship's language. "You know, Dean," Frank had said during a 1967 recording, "we've been through a lot together. Shared a lot of secrets. It would be a shame if anything ever happened to break up our little family." "Nothing's gonna happen, Frank. We're solid." "Good. Because people who leave our family sometimes find life gets real complicated real fast." Dean's paranoia reached its peak in 1968 when he discovered that his house was being watched. The tapes from this period captured his conversations with private security consultants, his discussions with family members about potential threats, and most heartbreakingly, his growing isolation as he realized he couldn't trust anyone who might report back to Frank. The recordings documented Dean's careful withdrawal from the Rat Pack. What the public saw as Dean getting tired of the Vegas scene was actually a calculated escape plan. Dean began declining joint appearances, reducing his contact with Frank, and building alibis for his whereabouts during times when Frank might need favors. A 1969 recording captured Frank confronting Dean about his increased distance. "You avoiding me, Pally?" "Just been busy, Frank. You know how it is." "No, I don't know how it is. Why don't you explain it to me?" The tension in both voices was unmistakable. Dean was trying to save his own life without triggering Frank's legendary temper, while Frank was beginning to suspect that his oldest friend might be preparing to betray him. The final break came in 1970, documented in excruciating detail on Dean's tapes. Frank had asked Dean to provide an alibi for a night when a government witness had mysteriously disappeared. Dean's refusal marked the end of their friendship and the beginning of a Cold War that would last until Dean's death. "I can't do it, Frank. I won't do it." "You won't do what?" "Lie for a friend. I won't be part of whatever this is. Not anymore." Frank's response was quiet, controlled, and terrifying. "You sure about that, Dean? Because once you make that choice, there's no going back." The recordings from the 1970s and 1980s showed Dean living like a man under siege. He installed elaborate security systems, varied his routines, and avoided public places where he might encounter Frank or Frank's associates. The carefree entertainer who'd once owned Las Vegas became a prisoner in his own life. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the recordings was the evidence of Dean's continuing love for the man he'd come to fear. Late-night tapes captured Dean talking to himself about Frank, reminiscing about their early days together, mourning the loss of what had once been the most important friendship in his life. "I miss him," Dean had whispered on a tape from 1985. "God help me. I miss the son of a bitch. but I'd rather miss him than be dead because of him. The recordings revealed that Dean had maintained his careful distance from Frank right up until the end. When Frank's representatives reached out about various reunion projects, Dean's polite refusals were always recorded, along with his private fears about what accepting might mean. A particularly poignant recording from 1993 captured Dean's reaction to news of Frank's declining health. "He's sick, really sick this time. Part of me wants to call him, to make things right before it's too late. But the other part of me remembers why I've been hiding from him for 25 years. Some bridges you burned for good reasons." The final recording was made just days before Dean's death in December 1995. His voice was weak, but his resolve was clear. "If anyone finds these tapes, I want them to understand something. Frank Sinatra was the most talented man I ever knew, and probably the most dangerous. Our friendship was the best thing that ever happened to me, and it was also the thing that nearly destroyed me. I spent 40 years loving a man I was afraid to be alone with." That's the real story of the Rat Pack. Not the glamour, not the music, not the fun. It's the story of what happens when you realize your best friend is capable of having you killed. Dean's children struggled with what to do with the recordings. Publishing them would destroy Frank's reputation and confirm decades of speculation about his criminal connections. But keeping them secret felt like betraying their father's obvious intention to leave a record of the truth. The decision was made to preserve the tapes in a private archive, accessible to historians but sealed from public release until all parties were deceased. Dean Martin's final gift to the world wasn't another song or another movie. It was a 40-year audio documentary of what it meant to be Frank Sinatra's friend when friendship became indistinguishable from complicity. The recordings also revealed something that Dean's family had never fully understood: why their father had been so insistent on financial independence, why he'd diversified his investments so carefully, why he'd always maintained multiple residences and kept escape plans ready. Dean Martin hadn't just been preparing for retirement, he'd been preparing for the possibility that he might need to disappear. In the end, Dean Martin died peacefully in his sleep, but his secret recordings revealed that he'd spent decades expecting a very different kind of ending. The man who'd seemed so effortlessly cool on stage had been burning with anxiety in private, trapped between love and fear, loyalty and survival. The tapes stand as perhaps the most intimate portrait ever recorded of Frank Sinatra's true nature. Not the public persona of the chairman of the board, but the private reality of a man whose friendship came with a price that even his closest friends found too dangerous to pay. If this shocking story of friendship, fear, and hidden truths moved you, show your appreciation with a like, because some secrets are too dangerous to take to the grave, but too explosive to reveal while everyone's still alive. What do you think? Was Dean right to fear Frank, or was paranoia destroying a great friendship? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of entertainment, where loyalty and terror often walked hand in hand.